Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep today into something that, well, really shapes every single part of who we are. How the experiences we have as kids, how those experiences impact us as adults. All those early events, the relationships we have as kids, it really lays the groundwork for so much. Our emotional responses, the way we make decisions, how we connect with other people, and honestly, it even affects our overall well-being.
And that's exactly what we are going to get into today. You, our listener, you are all about really getting a deep understanding of things,
Hmm.
but quickly and efficiently, right? You don't want to get bogged down in the tiny little details.
Exactly.
So that is what we're aiming for. We have taken all these really important insights from developmental psychology and boiled them down to that core knowledge,
Yeah.
the stuff that really matters,
Mm.
about how those early years, those really formative years, shape us.
Yeah, I mean, it seems kind of obvious that childhood is important, right?
Right.
But the real interesting stuff is in figuring out, like, the specific ways it shapes us.
Absolutely. And, developmental psychology has all these really great frameworks that can help us understand this. So, for example, there's Erikson's stages of psychosocial development.
Okay.
So basically what he said is that we face these particular psychosocial challenges, throughout our lives. But the really interesting part is that how we deal with these challenges in childhood and actually directly influences who we become as adults,
Yeah.
our
Hmm.
personality,
Yeah.
even our ability to deal with different social and emotional situations.
Right. So, like, if we think about that very first stage, right? Trust versus mistrust. That happens when we are infants.
Yeah.
So if their needs are constantly being met, they're going to develop that sense of trust in the world and people that are around them, right? But if they don't have that consistent care, well, Erikson's theory is that later on, that can lead to problems forming close relationships, real trusting relationships, because
Exactly
there's
right.
that lack of trust from the beginning.
And that's such a good point because it really emphasizes how development happens in a sequence.
Hmm.
So any unresolved conflicts we have early on, well, they don't just disappear.
Right.
They can create these weaknesses that we carry with us,
Hmm.
these vulnerabilities that can really show up as we try to navigate adult life. It's
Yeah.
all building upon the previous stage. So if you have a
Hmm.
shaky foundation,
Yeah.
it can impact everything that comes after that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Then there's Jean Piaget and his theory of cognitive development, right? He had these four stages: sensoromotor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and then formal operational. And I feel like sometimes people just like oversimplify it and think, oh, well, that's just kids getting smarter over time. But Piaget was really saying something more than that, that the way kids think is actually fundamentally different at each of these stages.
Yeah, exactly. And the amazing thing is how the cognitive skills we develop in childhood, they really form the basis for how our brains work as adults.
Yeah.
Think about it. From when we're babies, understanding the world through our senses, to when we're teenagers and able to think abstractly and use logic, it all builds up. It's not just about learning more facts. It's about this huge shift in how we understand everything around us.
Hmm.
For instance, when a baby's in the sensory motor stage, all they understand is what they can see right in front of them.
Right.
Like the idea that something still exists even when they can't see it, that's called object permanence, and that develops later during the pre-operational stage. That is like a whole different way of thinking.
That's a great example. And we can't forget about Sigmund Freud and his psychosexual theory, right? Even though some of his specific ideas are, well, they're definitely debated in psychology today, his idea that early childhood experiences can really shape our personality, that's still important to think about. He believed that if we don't resolve conflicts during those early stages of development, we can end up with unhealthy coping mechanisms as adults.
Right. Even if we look at Freud's stages a bit differently today, his work really showed how important those early drives and experiences are to how our personality develops.
Yeah.
Like the idea that those early years can leave these lasting marks, even if we don't realize it, that's powerful stuff.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got these big theories. But there are also some really basic ideas that come up over and over again in developmental psychology, right? Like, what about that classic nature versus nurture debate? It's obviously not one or the other, right?
No, not at all. It's more about how our genes and our environment work together.
Hmm.
And the experiences we have during childhood are super important for how our genes actually express themselves. Like our genes might give us a starting point or make us tend towards certain things. But our environment, especially those early years, that really determines how those genes actually play out and who we end up becoming.
Yeah, so it's like this complex interaction between those two things.
Exactly.
What about this idea of continuity versus stages in development? Like, is it a smooth process where we gradually develop, or is it more like we have these distinct jumps and changes?
That's a great question, and different theories have different answers. Some focus on the smooth changes, others on the jumps.
Right.
But what's really important to understand is that no matter how you look at it, the experiences we have in childhood, those are super important for shaping our path as we become adults.
And then, of course, there's the question of stability versus change. Like, are we basically just, like, older versions of our childhood selves? Or do we really change and grow as we get older?
Well, some of our personality traits and behaviors that we develop in childhood, those can stay pretty stable over time. But we're not stuck. We keep evolving and adapting throughout our whole lives. Childhood might set us on a certain path, but we can definitely change and grow. New experiences and relationships can really influence who we become.
So we're not, like, destined to be a certain way just because of our childhood, then.
Exactly. We have a lot of power to change and grow.
Okay, so it's pretty clear that childhood is really important. But let's dig into one specific area that seems to be really, really crucial. Early attachment. We hear so much about attachment these days.
Yeah, and there's a good reason for that. John Bowlby's attachment theory, that really changed the way we understand how our social and emotional development works. His main idea was that the bond a baby forms with their primary caregiver, that's not just about getting their basic needs met like food and stuff. It's actually like a blueprint for all the relationships they'll have later in life.
Yeah.
It creates this internal working model that shapes their expectations about relationships.
Well, that's interesting. So that very first relationship, the most important one we have, that really sets the stage for how we think we should be treated in relationships and how we behave in relationships.
Exactly. It's based on those early interactions, whether they were loving and consistent or maybe inconsistent and neglectful. And that creates our expectations, our beliefs about ourselves in relationships, and our behaviors in relationships. It affects us our entire lives. If we have those nurturing, responsive caregivers early on, we develop an internal working model that expects secure attachments. But if those early experiences are negative or inconsistent, well, that can unfortunately cause problems later on when we try to form healthy, trusting bonds.
And all of this leads to those different attachment styles that we hear about, right? Like secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment.
Yeah, exactly. So secure attachment usually happens when caregivers are really good at responding to a child's needs. They're consistent and reliable. And as adults, people who had that secure attachment, they tend to have healthy relationships that are based on trust. They're comfortable talking about their needs and feelings, and they are okay with both being close to people and being independent. Basically, those early experiences taught them that they deserve love and support and that other people can be dependable.
That makes a lot of sense. So that's like the ideal situation, right?
Yeah, it's a really great foundation for healthy relationships.
But what if those early experiences weren't so consistent or reliable? Like, what happens then?
So in those situations, we often see what's called anxious attachment. Sometimes it's called anxious preoccupied. It develops when a caregiver is sometimes really attentive and loving, but then other times they're unavailable or insensitive. And the thing is, as adults, people with this attachment style, they really crave closeness and intimacy, but they're also terrified of being abandoned.
Yeah.
So they might be clingy or constantly need reassurance from their partners. It's because those early experiences created this uncertainty about whether their needs would be met.
And then there's avoidant attachment. What kind of early experiences usually lead to that?
Avoidant attachment, or sometimes it's called avoidant dismissive, that often comes from having a caregiver who is emotionally distant or just not very responsive. And as adults, people with this attachment style, they often put a lot of emphasis on being independent. They might have trouble with vulnerability and intimacy in relationships. Sometimes they even have a hard time expressing their own emotions, and they might dismiss the emotions of others too. It's like they learned that their emotional needs wouldn't be met reliably, so they just shut down a bit emotionally and became more independent.
That's really interesting. And then there's also disorganized attachment, which sounds especially difficult. What usually causes that one?
Disorganized attachment that usually develops from early experiences that were chaotic or even traumatic, like abuse or severe neglect. It happens when the person who should be a source of comfort is actually also a source of fear. And that's really confusing for a kid. And as adults, people with this attachment style, they can have all sorts of conflicting behaviors in relationships. They might want to be close to people, but then they might push them away. It can make their relationships really unpredictable and even painful.
So knowing all this, what are the long-term effects of these different attachment styles? Like, how do they actually impact people as they become adults?
Well, the impact is huge, and it affects a lot of different areas of life, like having a secure attachment in infancy That's linked to being more socially skilled and having fewer problems with emotions and behavior later on. Adults who are securely attached as kids, they say they have happier relationships, romantic relationships that are more stable and based on trust and communication.
That makes sense.
But if someone has an insecure attachment style, whether it's anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, that's often associated with problems in social situations and communication in relationships. There's often more anxiety in relationships, lower self-esteem, and more troublemaking in keeping friends and having close relationships. Insecure attachment can even make people more likely to develop mental health problems like depression and anxiety as adults.
Wow, that's a really big impact. So if someone had those difficult early experiences and developed an insecure attachment style, are they just stuck with that forever? Or can it change?
That's a really good question. And the good news is, even though those early attachment experiences are super important, research shows that attachment styles can change. You know, positive experiences later in life, like having good friends, healthy romantic relationships, or even going to therapy, those things can help people with insecure attachment styles learn to relate to others in a more secure way. Our brains are amazing. They can actually grow and change throughout our whole lives. And attachment patterns, they're not set in stone. They can change too.
That's really hopeful to know. Okay, so we've talked about how those positive early relationships are so important for healthy development. But now let's switch gears a bit and talk about what happens when those early experiences are full of challenges and even trauma. Let's talk about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Yeah, ACEs.
Well,
That's a really important topic if we want to understand how childhood affects adult well-being. Basically, ACEs are traumatic events that happen during childhood. Things like different types of abuse, neglect, and even problems within the family, like maybe parents getting separated, substance abuse in the home, or a caregiver having a mental illness. The original research on ACEs, they came up with 10 specific categories, but now we understand that it's even broader than that. We know that things like violence in the community, experiences of racism, and just living in poverty, those can all be really traumatic for kids too.
and all the research shows that there's this really strong connection between having ACEs and having all sorts of negative outcomes later in life, right?
Absolutely. The more ACEs someone has during their childhood, the more likely they are to have negative consequences when they're adults. It affects their health, their social life, everything.
Wow.
Like their chances of having chronic health problems go way up. Things like heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and their risk of mental health problems increases too, like depression and substance abuse.
Hmm.
But it's not just that. ACEs are also linked to problems in school, trouble finding a job, and even dying younger. It's really serious.
So it sounds like having ACEs can really affect someone's whole life. You talked about quantifying the impact earlier.
Right.
Can you give us some specific examples of what that looks like?
Sure. So studies have shown that adults who had 4 or more ACEs when they were kids, they're way more likely to have breathing problems, have a stroke, get cancer, have heart problems, develop asthma, and get diabetes.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's really a wide range of health issues. And one of the most shocking findings is that all those ACEs together, they can actually shorten someone's life by almost 20 years compared to people who didn't have any ACEs. 20 years. That's a huge difference.
That's a really long time. It's scary to think about how much those early experiences can affect us. But what's actually happening in our bodies and minds that makes those early traumas have such a big impact and last for so long?
Well, there are a few things going on. One big factor is our stress response system. When kids go through a lot of stressful stuff, especially without having supportive adults around to help them cope, their stress response system gets stuck in overdrive. It's like constantly pushing the gas pedal to the floor. And when that happens for a long time, it's called toxic stress.
Hmm. So, like, imagine driving a car and never letting up on the gas.
Exactly. It's going to wear down the engine, right? That's what toxic stress does to our bodies.
And it affects the brain too, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially the developing brain. That constant stress can mess with the way the brain develops, especially the parts that are important for learning, memory, thinking, and emotions. And it can also weaken the immune system, which makes people more vulnerable to getting sick throughout their lives.
So it affects both our physical and mental health.
Exactly. But it goes even beyond that. ACEs can also make people more likely to develop unhealthy coping habits as adults. Like they might start smoking, using drugs, or having risky sex.
Oh, yeah. It makes sense that people would try to find ways to cope with all that pain.
Yeah, but unfortunately, those unhealthy habits just lead to more problems in the long run. And then there are the social and economic effects of ACEs. People who had a lot of ACEs, They are more likely to struggle with things like finding a job, staying out of poverty, even staying out of jail.
So it's like this cycle of disadvantage.
Yeah, exactly. It can be hard to break free from. And then there's this other thing called intergenerational transmission. Basically, it means that when parents have experienced a lot of trauma themselves, they might have trouble being good parents to their own kids.
Oh, right. Because they might not have learned how to provide that stable, loving environment.
Exactly. And that can lead to cycles of trauma that continue through generations of a family.
It's really sad to think about how ACEs can affect people for so long and even impact the next generation. But you mentioned earlier that there are things that can help, like protective factors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Having strong, supportive relationships with adults during childhood, that can make a huge difference. Those relationships can create a sense of safety and security that helps kids cope with stress and trauma.
So, like, even if a child is going through a lot of difficult stuff, if they have someone they can rely on, someone who cares about them and supports them, that can really protect them.
Yeah, exactly. And thankfully, we're learning more and more about how to help people who have experienced trauma. There are a lot of new approaches to therapy and support that are really effective.
That's good to hear. So, we've talked about the negative side of things. What about the positive side? Like, what about those positive childhood experiences or PCEs? It seems like focusing on the positive could be really helpful, especially when we are thinking about all the challenges that come with ACEs.
You're right. PCEs, they're like the opposite of ACEs. They're all those good things that happen in childhood, like feeling safe and loved, having a family that supports you, feeling connected to your community, doing well in school, having good friends. It's all about recognizing those positive influences that can help kids thrive.
So, it's not just about avoiding the bad stuff, it's about actively creating those positive experiences.
Exactly. And research shows that having more PCEs is linked to a whole bunch of good things in adulthood. Well, people who have more PCEs as kids, they tend to be healthier as adults, both physically and mentally, and are less likely to develop mental health problems like depression.
It makes sense that having good experiences would lead to good outcomes, but it's really cool to see the research proving it. You mentioned that PCCs can even protect kids from the negative effects of ACEs.
Yeah, it's true. Positive experiences can actually buffer the impact of trauma. Having those strong relationships and support systems, it can really help kids develop resilience, which means they're better able to bounce back from difficult times. There was even one study that found that even for people who had a lot of ACEs, the more PCEs they had, the less likely they were to have depression as adults.
Wow, that's amazing. So even if someone has been through some really tough things, having those positive experiences can still make a huge difference.
It really shows the power of those positive experiences.
So which specific types of positive experiences seem to be the most important?
Well, a few things stand out. Having open communication in the family, where everyone feels comfortable talking about their feelings. Having a supportive family that's there for you no matter what. Having good friends who are reliable and supportive. And feeling like you belong at school. All of those things make a big difference.
It sounds like it's all about feeling loved, accepted, and supported.
Yeah, pretty much. And another interesting finding is that having strong relationships with parents during childhood is actually linked to people feeling happier and more successful as adults.
Hmm.
Those positive relationships early on, they help kids learn how to manage their emotions and they build up their self-esteem.
And it's not just about those individual relationships, right? There are also broader things that can affect a child's well-being, right? Like what's going on in their community.
Yeah, totally. So on top of having those good relationships with caregivers, having a positive group of friends is really important. And doing well in school, feeling like you're good at things, that also helps a lot. And then there's having other adults in your life who care about you and support you, not just your parents. And then, of course, living in a community that has good resources and supports available, like financial help if you need it, good health care, safe housing, and affordable childcare. All of those things create a much better environment for kids to grow up in.
So it's like this whole system of support that can make a difference. It's not just about one or two things. Now, let's talk about how all of this actually affects the brain. Because, the brain is constantly developing during childhood. So how do those early experiences, both good and bad, actually change the way our brains work?
That is the really fascinating part. So the human brain, it grows like crazy during childhood. In fact, almost 90% of brain growth happens before kids even start kindergarten. It's this huge period of development where the brain is making all these connections, building the foundation for more complex thinking later on. And all those early experiences both the good and the bad ones, they actually shape how those connections are made.
So those first few years are super important for how our brains develop. It's not just about growing physically. It's about building those neural pathways that will affect how we think and feel our whole lives.
Right. And you know what's really cool? Those early interactions with caregivers, having lots of opportunities to learn and explore, those things are super important for those brain connections to form properly. Then, as kids become teenagers, their brains keep developing, and they get better at things like learning, thinking abstractly, using logic, and even thinking about their own thinking.
So it's like this constant process of growth and change in the brain. But what if things aren't going well? Like, what happens to brain development if a child is dealing with a lot of trauma or stress?
Unfortunately, when kids go through a lot of difficult stuff early on, it can mess with the way their brains develop. It can affect things like their working memory, which is how we hold information in our minds, their overall intelligence, their attention span, and their ability to understand complicated ideas. All those important skills we use as adults to navigate the world, they depend on having a healthy brain. And when kids experience a lot of adversity, it can disrupt that healthy development.
Mm.
And then there's the emotional side of things. The brain plays a huge role in how we manage our emotions.
Right.
As kids get older, the part of their brain that controls impulses and planning that gets more developed. But if kids experience a lot of trauma or live in poverty, it can really affect how that part of the brain develops.
So it can make it harder for them to regulate their emotions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, having those secure attachments in childhood, that actually helps those emotional regulation centers develop in a healthy way. So having those loving, supportive relationships early on, it can really set kids up for success in managing their emotions later in life.
So basically, how our brains develop during those early years really shapes how we experience and handle our emotions as adults.
Exactly. And all of that brain development and how it's affected by our experiences, it also influences how we behave as adults.
Yeah.
Like the part of our brain that's responsible for making good decisions and controlling our impulses, that keeps developing until we are in our 20s.
Wow. So our brains are still developing even when we are young adults.
They are. And if kids experience things like neglect or chronic stress, it can interfere with that development. And that can lead to problems with memory, learning, and regulating emotions. It can even affect how we see the world and how we react to things.
So it really is all connected. Our early experiences shape our brains, and our brains shape how we think, feel, and behave. But we can't just talk about childhood without thinking about all the different social and cultural influences that are at play, right?
Absolutely. And the family is where it all starts. It's the main social environment for most kids, and it has a huge impact on their personality and how they behave. The relationships between parents and kids, those attachment patterns we talked about, and how parents raise their kids, that all has a lasting impact on how those kids will be as adults. It affects their relationships, their emotional skills, everything.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the influence of siblings. Those relationships can also be really important for how kids learn to socialize.
And as kids get older, their social world gets bigger, right? They
Yeah.
start to have friends and become part of different groups.
Exactly. Friends and peer groups, they're really important for social and personality development. Hanging out with other kids is how kids learn social skills, figure out what's normal and expected, and develop a sense of belonging. And guess what? Kids who had secure attachments when they were little, they tend to have better friendships later on.
That makes sense.
But of course, peer pressure can be good or bad. It can motivate kids to do well in school, but it can also lead them to do risky things.
Right, right. So it's a mixed bag. And then there's the even bigger picture, right? The culture that a child grows up in. That has a huge impact too, doesn't it?
It totally does. Culture, that means all the shared values, beliefs, traditions, and ways of doing things that a group of people has. And that shapes a child's development in so many ways. It affects how they see the world, how they learn, and how they act in different situations. Different cultures have different ways of parenting, different expectations for kids at different ages, different ways of expressing and understanding emotions, different ideas about responsibility, and even different ways of thinking about what's normal for kids at different stages of development.
So culture really influences every part of a child's life.
It really does.
Yeah.
It affects everything from how they learn language and understand concepts to how they make friends, show their feelings, and develop their own sense of who they are.
And of course, we can't forget about socioeconomic factors like a child's economic background and social status. Those things can have a big impact on their life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A child's socioeconomic status, that basically means their family's income, education level, and social standing. And those things can have a huge impact on their whole life trajectory. Unfortunately, kids who grew up in poverty, they're more likely to experience those ACEs we talked about, and they're also more likely to have health problems as adults. It's because they often don't have access to the same resources and opportunities as kids from wealthier families. Like, they might not have access to good schools, healthcare, or even healthy food. And all of that can lead to what's called cumulative disadvantage, where the negative effects of poverty just keep piling up over time.
It's really unfair how much your background can affect your whole life. But it sounds like we're starting to understand these connections better and hopefully finding ways to help kids who are facing these challenges. Now, to really understand how childhood experiences affect us long term, scientists do these really cool studies called longitudinal studies, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Longitudinal studies are amazing.
Hmm.
Basically, they follow the same group of people over a long period of time, sometimes for decades. It's like a really long movie of someone's life.
I love that analogy.
And they help us see how early experiences actually play out over time. Like, do they have the same friends when they're adults? Do they end up going to college? What kind of job do they get? Do they get married? Do they have kids?
So we can actually see the real life consequences of those early experiences.
Exactly. And there have been some groundbreaking longitudinal studies that have taught us so much, like the Zurich longitudinal studies, the Fels longitudinal study, the Berkeley Growth and Guidance studies, the Oakland Growth Study, the Lothian birth cohorts, and the Terman study of the gifted. And of course, there's the famous Harvard study of adult development, which includes the Grant study.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one. It's been going on for like forever, right?
Yeah, over 80 years. They've been following the same group of people since they were teenagers, and has given us some amazing insights. For example, they found that having a close, warm relationship with your mom during childhood is actually linked to earning more money and having a lower chance of getting dementia when you're older. And having a good relationship with your dad is linked to less anxiety, enjoying vacations more, and just being more satisfied with your life overall when you are in your 70s. And get this, they even found that doing chores as a kid is linked to being more successful in your career and being happier overall as an adult.
Really? That's so interesting. It's like all these little things from childhood can have these unexpected long-term effects. What about those British studies you mentioned, like that 1958 study?
Yeah, the 1958 National Child Development Study. That one's been going on for a long time too, and it's given us a lot of great information. For example, they found that if a mom smokes while she's pregnant, it can have negative effects on her child that last into adulthood. They've also learned a lot about how mental health problems develop over a person's entire life, and they've seen how economic inequality can be passed down from one generation to the next. It's really fascinating stuff.
It really is. So these longitudinal studies, they've also backed up a lot of what we've been talking about with ACEs and PCEs, right?
Oh, definitely. They've shown that having a lot of ACEs can really increase your risk of having health and mental health problems throughout your life. And on the flip side, they've shown that having lots of PCEs can really protect you from those negative outcomes. There was even one study that followed people for 45 years, and it showed that experiencing sexual abuse as a child can lead to all sorts of problems in adulthood.
It's amazing how these studies can show us those long-term connections. But you said earlier that longitudinal studies can be tricky to do, right?
Yeah, they definitely have their challenges. They're super expensive because you have to follow people for so long. It's hard to keep people involved in the study for decades. And sometimes, people's memories of their childhood aren't totally accurate, which can affect the results. But even with all those challenges, longitudinal studies are still one of the best ways to understand how childhood experiences shape who we become as adults.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important message you want our listeners to take away?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that our childhood experiences really matter. They shape every part of our lives as adults. Our relationships, our health, our minds, our behavior, everything.
Hmm.
Those early years, they really lay the foundation for who we become.
And for our listener who is looking for a clear, concise explanation of this complex topic, hopefully this deep dive was helpful. We've tried to give you the key insights without overwhelming you with too much information.
And before we go, I have one last thought for you to ponder. Think back to your own childhood. Pick one specific memory, maybe a relationship with someone, an experience you had, or a challenge you faced. And think about how that might be influencing your life today, even in small ways. It can be really eye-opening to see how those early experiences are still shaping who you are.
It's fascinating to think about, and if you are interested in learning more about this stuff, there's a whole world of research out there on developmental psychology.
Keep exploring, it's worth it.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.